I'm Rico Brouwer, talking to whistleblower turned whistleblower attorney Jesselyn Radack about how to defend against lawfare. So welcome in Café Weltschmerz. Lawfare is using the law as a weapon against truth-telling, and how to defend that is what we're going to talk about with my guest out of Washington, I think, Jesselyn Radack. Welcome.
Thank you.
All right.
Thank you for having me.
Great that you're here. So, I introduce you as a whistleblower, but you're also a human rights lawyer, and you've been defending whistleblowers such as Thomas Drake and Edward Snowden. So welcome. In this interview, I would like to learn how you assess our legal system is functioning with regards to whistleblowers. And in this conversation, we will talk about current affairs, what's happening with Chelsea Manning and a reality winner and Assange, and Ed Snowden, who's just wrote a book, and there's stuff going on about the book, so I'm going to ask you about that as well. But before we go there, could you tell the audience what made you pursue a career in law, how that ended you up at the Justice Department working there as their ethics advisor, and why you left?
I think growing up, I always had a strong sense of fairness and right and wrong. My father was a lawyer, and I thought it would be a career path where I could do something I enjoy, but also make a difference. I know it sounds corny to say everyone wants to go to law school, so they can move the world and social justice and that kind of thing. But I believed it, and I still do. So that's what motivated me to go into law. In terms of whistleblowing, I was motivated to get into this very niche area because of my own experience having blown the whistle and the fallout that I ended up suffering because of that. I realized, here is a very specialized area of law that's not well developed, and where people are just getting hammered by the government in these very weird leak cases.
Is that taught at all at law school?
No, I can tell you for a fact they don't teach whistleblower law at law school. Usually when they teach employment law, whistleblower law may be a day or two subsection of that, or it may be one day of a criminal law class, but it's certainly not usually taught as a standalone subject because it's so narrow, and it's actually rarely used, especially in the criminal context.
Well, yeah, when you were at school, but fast forward to where we are now, those are the high-profile things going on all over the world currently. Now,
I think it should be taught in law school, but occasionally I'll be invited to give a guest lecture on the implications of whistleblower law.
Have you ever been? Have you ever been invited to be guest lecturer or no?
Oh yeah, I've guest lectured on this at Yale, where I went for law school, and locally I've taught classes in legal ethics where I've introduced it as a subject, as a subpart of legal ethics, whistleblowing being part of that. So again, I think it's something that's increasingly going to become relevant, but hasn't been enough for a standalone class yet that I've ever seen.
Okay. So you started working as an ethics advisor for the Justice Department. Could you elaborate on what made you leave that job?
What made me leave was, as the ethics advisor, we were supposed to give advice prospectively to try to keep government employees out of trouble. And I was consulted in the first high-profile terrorism prosecution after 9/11 in the case of the American Taliban, John Walker Lind. He was actually just very recently released from prison. But I had rendered advice to the effect that they could not interrogate him without an attorney, and certainly they could not torture him or use unjustified any kind of force at all. And basically that advice was ignored. He was interrogated without a lawyer. They improperly Mirandized him, saying, well, you have a right to a lawyer, but there are no lawyers out here in Afghanistan, which is not a proper reading of his rights. And then they held him in a box for a number of days, a coffin-like box, which obviously is unconstitutional and a violation of many provisions of the Constitution. But still, nonetheless, I explained that they could use the fruits of that intelligence gathering for investigation, intelligence gathering purposes, but not for criminal prosecution. And they decided to prosecute anyway. So when that became public and the judge wanted information about that problematic interrogation, the government withheld the advice I had given as the ethics attorney, had withheld that from the court, and I ended up blowing the whistle and making that information public.
Yeah, so they said they didn't have your emails, or they lost your emails, and you said, I have a backup. Volunteered.
I did. I had kept a copy of my emails in case they disappeared, which they had because they had been withheld from the courts, but I had kept a backup copy, and I tried to give it to the judge. But by that point, I had resigned from the Justice Department. Okay. And so I ended up giving them to the media, which ultimately caused the case to collapse.
So does that happen often? You're a defense attorney, so you're in court quite often. Are you up against lost emails or lost any other evidence situations?
It certainly happened before. I would like to try to give the benefit of the doubt to the government, especially in this day and age where they're much better at archiving things, that stuff doesn't get lost. But certainly, I mean, we had that come up in Tom Drake's espionage prosecution, where the government said they didn't have any evidence of his whistleblowing because it had been destroyed pursuant to a document destruction policy. That ended up being a total fabrication because in reality, they had a document retention policy. And so the fact that they conveniently had no evidence of his quite extensive whistleblowing turned out to be untrue. And especially in this day and age where everything's backed up and everything's stored, and the NSA has built an entire data storage facility in Utah for this purpose, it really would sound unbelievable if they were trying to claim that in 2019 as opposed to 2009 or when I blew the whistle back in 2002.
Yeah. Well, we have that here in Holland as well. So for our Dutch viewers, we have Bonnetje van Teven, which is the receipt, one of our what's it called? Ministers here appear to have lost, but it was just backup. I mean, it was found anyway, or a fotorolletje. Anyway, those are the Dutch anecdotes of missing stuff. Now, recently, in the case of Julian Assange, we also learned that the British Crown Prosecution Service deleted correspondence. And we learned that through a FOIA, Freedom of Information Act request by Stefania Maurizi, who was here, a guest as well. So, you want to comment on that one?
Yes, it defies credulity that in a case as watched and high profile as that of Julian Assange, that these documents would just disappear. I find that very hard to believe, and it smacks of bad faith to the extent that Stefania's FOIAing them. They're obviously of huge public interest value. And then the fact that suddenly they're now asserting that they've disappeared or they don't have them anymore. It smacks of bad faith and a corrupt intent rather than a good faith effort to give someone a fair process that they're entitled to.
Yeah, okay, thank you. Okay, so you were working as the a legal ethics advisor for the Department of Justice. That was quite a while ago. What's your assessment on how that is functioning today?
I think they've had a number of challenges over the years. Most recently, they did offer some good ethics advice, but the top level of the Justice Department ignored the ethics advice. And that was pretty much the problem I had back when I worked there. We gave ethical advice, but the much higher level at the Attorney General and Deputy Attorney General level ignored that advice, and not only ignored it, but did the opposite and later tried to cover it up. So while it's a good thing that they would seek ethics advice and they have people, a department, a small office willing to give that advice, when you routinely ignore that advice, it seems like just you're going through this exercise to say you did it, but you don't really mean it or you don't care.
Yeah. So how is this, if you look back to the first question I asked you is why did you start in law school? So how has these examples changed your view of the legal system?
I think after I blew the whistle, in law school, I saw the Department of Justice as a force of good and overall doing good work and trying to change things for the better and trying to make a difference. But I felt like, especially after 9/11, all of that really changed. And it became more about government control, government power, and keeping secret some of the darkest conduct our country has engaged in, like torture, the torture program, secret surveillance, and war crimes. And so I saw that general mission to, the motto was like, we're not trying to, score a point or win. We just want to do justice. And I felt like that mission was being sublimated to an ever-expanding executive branch and a government who wanted to use its power at the fullest possible level with as few restrictions or accountability as possible.
Yeah. So you wrote a book about your experience called Traitor, 2012. So I did my research on you preparing for this interview, but that book started you being on interviews like this, didn't it?
It did. Yes, certainly writing about what I went through. That book, along with a series of investigative journalistic pieces, actually helped me on this career path. Jane Mayer of The New Yorker did a very in-depth investigative piece about the malfeasance that had occurred in the prosecution of John Walker Lindh, and interviewed me as part of that. And I think that's where I found my voice, and gained a full appreciation and understanding of the lengths the government will go to utterly destroy someone who tries to dissent or tells the truth or contradicts the government's party line on something. Yeah. And God help you if you reveal one of the government's biggest secrets, like secret surveillance or torture. They will come after you with both guns blazing.
Well, all right. So another book that was just recently released, like yesterday, is by Edward Snowden. And he got the CIA and the NSA on his tail again with the civil lawsuit because he allegedly published, he published stuff that was on the non-disclosure. So would you care to comment on that?
As he has said, as Ed Snowden has said, he takes his oath to uphold and defend the Constitution more seriously than any secrecy agreement with an agency, and he's correct in that calculus. I find it very disingenuous, for the government to be claiming he didn't go through pre-publication review when you look at the entire nature of his disclosures, which were about government secrecy and the government breaking the law under the cloak of secrecy. So it seems kind of laughable for the government to be claiming he should have, had his work reviewed in a process that notoriously has dragged out for people writing books such as his, and has censored books such as his. So I found that very disingenuous by the government that they would even suggest that he go through a process like that. And in terms of filing the lawsuit to go after the proceeds, I feel like that's just further government retaliation, and they really want to exact their pound of flesh. And he's kind of been 2 steps ahead of them at every juncture of this saga. And, again, they're just engaging in this petty retaliation by saying they're going to go after the proceeds so he won't profit from his crime, and releasing an inflammatory press release. And again, the unintended consequences, it has gone on to suddenly propel his book to the #1 Amazon bestseller list.
And also Snowden going on Twitter and using it as, look, the book is very dangerous. You might want to buy a copy or something.
Exactly. The government doesn't want you to buy this book,
yeah.
or me to get any kind of benefit from the book. To me, you couldn't get a better endorsement from the government for why you should buy and read that particular book.
So why did it do it then? Is it plain stupid, or what?
I think the government tends to get so wrapped up in these cases that they can't see the forest through the trees. If they said nothing about it, yes, he would have gotten publicity for a couple days, during the initial launch of the book. But now, because they've actually done this, I think they don't think about the long-term consequences of what they do. I think government can be very reactive, especially when it comes to whistleblowers. Very reactive and very punitive and very shoot from the hip, which is why you get a lot of this improvised retaliation that seems almost silly. When you think about the petty and vindictive ways they've gone after some whistleblowers, not allowing them in the lunchroom, or auditing their petty cash and how much money they put in a candy machine, kind of stuff. And here, I think, again, they just can't stand the fact that they were outsmarted yet again by Edward Snowden.
Who's
because
they
he
then?
Managed to get this.
Who is they then? Who is that?
They is the Justice Department and the intelligence community. So the intelligence community includes CIA and NSA and DIA, a lot of the 3-letter agencies that you don't know much about how they operate. But so that's who I mean, the intelligence community establishment and the law enforcement establishment. And again, I think they feel foiled once again by Snowden, and as sort of a thumb in their eye. Just the fact that he was able to pull this off without them being able to interfere, without their knowledge. And clearly this is their hissy fit afterwards.
So you're in court defending whistleblowers. So you're sitting on one side of that aisle, and the defense attorneys of the other party, of those agencies, sitting on the other side. Do you regard yourselves as colleagues, or how does that work then?
It really depends. Like in Tom Drake's case, the government attorneys were vicious and personally nasty and very aggressive towards us. But in a more recent case I've been working in, the government has been much more low-key. So I think it actually depends on the prosecutor for the government. I think it depends on the leadership in the government and how much they're going to double down in a case. Again, like I said, sometimes opposing counsel, lawyers are supposed to comport themselves with a certain amount of decorum, no matter how adversarial things get. But I have seen lawyers behave in really over-the-top ways and overly theatrical ways, and with weird negativity where the judge has had to kind of rein it in. And I've also litigated against government attorneys who are also really good and who are just trying to do their job and realize we're just on different sides of a very controversial issue.
Okay, so I read pieces of the book. I mean, it's only out for a day. Let me do a few quotes and talk about that one. So the book is called Permanent Record, and in it he says, the ACLU, American Civil Liberties Union, tried to challenge the surveillance done by the NSA, and then a curious thing happened in court. The government didn't defend itself on the ground of legitimacy of their surveillance activities, but said that the existence of such surveillance was not officially proven, so there could be no lawsuit, and they said leaks to journalists don't count. And then the US Supreme Court decided to follow that line of reasoning by the US government. So, with this book, is that line of defense now obsoleted, you think?
I think in these most controversial cases involving rendition and torture and surveillance, the government has raised something called the state secrets privilege, which is even though this, whatever the secret is known around the world, they still are maintaining that it's a secret and it would do grave damage if people knew about it. It looks sillier and sillier when the entire world is talking about a particular program, when Oscar-winning movies are made about the program, when Pulitzer Prize-winning articles are published about the program, and the government still wants to pretend that they can neither confirm nor deny that the program exists. Yeah. So it becomes almost a theater of the absurd at a certain point, and I think that was something that Edward was trying to point out, and did so pretty effectively, that supposedly this is all still a secret, even if everybody knows about it. The government is saying, oh, our employees should not read the newspaper if there's an article about WikiLeaks. Seriously? You're trying to tell an entire government force of hundreds of thousands of people they shouldn't read a newspaper because there might be an article on WikiLeaks? I understand the government saying you can't go on WikiLeaks website from your government computer. I get that. But trying to control people's basic First Amendment rights to speak, to consume, to read, to participate in public debate is really over the top.
Yeah, well, that is what's happening. Another quote from that book. He says, the American intelligence community came to understand the rules of the American system better than the ones that created it. They effectively hacked the Constitution. So yeah, you can quote the First Amendment all you like, but Constitution is out the window. That's basically what he says. All three powers of government. So would you comment on that one?
Yes, I think the government would like to keep making the argument that these secrecy agreements and classification programs override the Constitution. Again, if they really believe that, they would litigate that issue in court like a grown-up rather than asserting a state secrets privilege to shut down any litigation about it. I mean, they keep making these same arguments, but the Constitution is paramount. And there's case law that government, you can't have a government agency that says, oh, you're not, our employees, when they go home, they're not allowed to use Facebook or something on their personal time, on their own computer, in their own home. I mean, again, the government can say what it wants, but judicially, it's not going to be enforceable.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So final quote then. In that book, said whistleblower protection laws typically state that one should first go through the chain of command before going public. Now, Snowden says his superiors were not only aware of what the agency was doing, they were actively directing it. They were complicit. So you can't really go through the chain of command. You need to go public. And then he chose his method for that. Leading up to a question, how do you protect people that make that decision in court? One of the tools that you have is whistleblower protection laws. Are they functional?
Yeah. First of all, most of the whistleblower protection laws have a specific carve-out that exempts people who are doing national security and intelligence from the protections of whistleblower laws. So the idea that those laws are available to protect whistleblowers who are at the NSA and the CIA is really a myth. And I can tell you from representing people like Thomas Drake, who was an NSA whistleblower upon whom Snowden says he based his own course of conduct. He watched Thomas Drake go through every internal mechanism. He went to his boss, he went to his boss's boss, he went to the NSA Inspector General, he went to the intelligence community Inspector General, he went to Congress. He blew every single whistle
in
that
order
you could. And not only did they fail to redress his problem, they turned around and retaliated against him in the exact same way they've tried to retaliate against everyone from Julian Assange to Edward Snowden by going after them with Espionage Act charges.
Yeah. So yeah, same thing in Europe. I mean, we have the European Union whistleblower protection, but that thing is not does not apply to European Union itself. So same line of reasoning. You remind me of that one.
Exactly. These laws can often be a paper tiger also because they have no enforcement mechanism. So it looks really good to have a law that says you may not retaliate against a whistleblower for revealing information that shows fraud, waste, abuse, or illegality. But then when the government does retaliate against you and does so in a vicious way, there's nothing you can do to enforce your right. I mean, it's pretty words on a piece of paper, but if there's no enforcement mechanism, it's really an empty protection and a paper tiger. Yeah. And I think that's something where there's been a huge breakdown both in the US and in other countries that have some sort of whistleblower protection.
Mm-hmm. You've also worked with John Kiriakou. He's
yes.
CIA whistleblower that told us about torture in Guantanamo Bay, like what you just mentioned. And he said about his defense that it wasn't about justice, but about mitigating damage. And he quoted one of his lawyer's words there. So what's your view on that? When you're defending a whistleblower, are you trying to seek a just approach or are you mitigating damage?
I think both. I mean, certainly when they're threatening your client with spending the rest of their life in jail, which has been pretty much what all my clients have been threatened with. I mean, the ones in the high profile cases have been threatened with sentences of 50 to 150 years. At that point, I mean, yes, you are trying to seek justice and get the truth out, but yeah, you're trying to mitigate their exposure, and you have to do both. It's not an either or, it's a both and. You have to do both. And it makes it really hard to do because when you're seeking justice for that prong of it, your hands are tied very much because a lot of these proceedings take place in secret. You're subject to a lot of classification rules that tie your hands. You can't raise a defense that what your client did was in the public interest. It's just yes, no. Did they leak or did they not leak? Did they keep information or did they not? They don't care. They're about the motive. And so when your clients have good motive, that's why it's been important in a number of these cases to be able to get that motive out through the media and through other means, because court will do everything to keep that under wraps. The fact that people usually don't leak because it's a good career move. They leak because they see something really wrong going on. People rarely, occasionally, the people who leak for fame and profit and revenge are usually people who are high up in the government trying to get a good book deal, but most whistleblowers have gotten no benefit from their disclosure, no personal, they get the benefit of being able to live with their conscience and sleep at night, but they're not getting money. In fact, they usually lose their jobs. They're often put under administrative or criminal investigation, and they get put on watch lists and stuff like that. So it's hardly, a good career move to become a whistleblower, and would be absurd for the government to suggest that whistleblowers have selfish motives. At least in the ones I've represented, that's never been the case.
No, that's okay. But another quote from the interview I did with Kiriakou is on the positive side. And he said, "It is funny, I won a lot of awards. And the funny part of it is the whole thing has made me famous. It made me a champion of civil rights and civil liberties and human rights and rule of law. That's not something I ever sought, it just happened." So that's public opinion for you, and that's the side effect that they don't seek, but that they do end up with.
And that's because of lawyers like me that try to flip the narrative, because the government always is going to paint the whistleblower as a traitor, a turncoat, a terrorist sympathizer, someone who tried to harm our country. And then as a lawyer, we try to put out a counter narrative like, no, this person actually wanted to tell the truth. And not only did they want to tell the truth, they wanted to tell the truth about some serious government misdeeds, dark ops programs, and other nefarious conduct that is in serious violation of civil, criminal, and humanitarian law. And so then, yes, eventually a number of whistleblowers end up getting a number of different awards that recognize their sacrifice. But the problem is that doesn't necessarily help them get their job back. It doesn't necessarily help them regain the family and friendships that have been damaged by their whistleblowing. It's very hard to claw your life back when the government has gone to every length to completely alienate you from your friends and your family and your professional peers and your workforce. I mean, they really go after every aspect of your life, and it's hard to come out of that unscathed. And to their great credit, John Kiriakou and Thomas Drake and Edward Snowden have been able to find life on the other side of whistleblowing, and that's a good outcome and something we strive to obtain for more whistleblowers. But it's been on the backs of people who had to pay enormous prices themselves.
Yeah, I talked to Thomas Drake also in an interview, and he mentioned just that. You were not doing only his legal defense, but defending him in a court of public opinion, when he had no voice to defend himself, because he came forward. You can't speak. Your attorney needs to speak for you, right?
Exactly. When you're under criminal investigation, the first thing any good criminal defense attorney will tell you is,
shut up.
Shut up. Exactly. And then at that point, you need to rely on other people to be your voice. And that becomes even more complicated because often your story and what you blew the whistle on are secret programs. So it's hard to find someone as easily to write about it, to talk about it, who even knows about it. I mean, like I said, the programs that people like Tom Drake and Ed Snowden and John Kiriakou are talking about are secret programs, some of which the government has even, at least initially, denied being a part of. Yeah. I mean, Jake Clapper, director of national intelligence, originally said, he was asked by Congress, are we surveilling innocent Americans? And he said, not wittingly, which was a total lie. He knew we were. The government has deliberately misstated and underreported the number of innocent civilians killed in drone strikes. Yeah. Again, the government has lied on the record about stuff, and that is complicated further when you gag whistleblowers with these NDAs and secrecy agreements and threats, frankly, of criminal prosecution because they tried to tell the truth.
Yeah. So has that changed over the... So you left the Department of Justice under the Bush administration and then started to work for whistleblowers under the Obama administration. Well, Obama is known for two things in my world, the drone war and the crackdown on whistleblowers, and now we're having Trump. So how has that progressed in the United States in your assessment?
It's progressed in a very negative direction, unfortunately, because with Obama, who prided himself as being the transparency president, he ended up unleashing the worst war on whistleblowers and using the Espionage Act to indict more people for whistleblower activity, going to the press about very questionably legal conduct than all presidents before, even Nixon. I mean, the last person who had been subject to this kind of treatment had been Pentagon Papers whistleblower Dan Ellsberg. But Obama reinvigorated that on steroids. And a lot of us kept saying, even people who liked Obama, which I did, I campaigned for Obama and voted for him, said, this is the most dangerous, reckless thing you're doing, because what will this power look like in the hands of someone we don't trust? And now you see that coming to full fruition with Trump, because here you have someone who, by all appearances, behaves in these very unhinged, undisciplined kind of ways and hates the media. And of course, the flip side of that is the people who are sources for the media, and is very vengeful and very vindictive and very thin-skinned. And so now, unfortunately, with Obama, you have put in place all these precedents for someone like Trump to run with and exploit. And that's why we now have 3 times as many leak investigations and prosecutions going on as we did under Obama, which is staggering because we're only 2 years into the Trump administration.
Yeah, with a possible 6 to go. Okay.
I hope not.
Sorry about that.
Right. No, we all worry about that. But I wouldn't even know if a Democratic president would. I mean, the only candidate in the U.S. elections who said they would not, there are a couple that said they wouldn't prosecute Assange. So I actually thought that was a step in the right direction, or a good sign. But I haven't seen any effort to repeal or refuse to use the Espionage Act against sources going forward. It may calm down again if we have another Democrat in office, but unfortunately, we just have this burgeoning national security state that's fairly boundless and has just accrued power and given itself so many unlimited powers that have been unchecked for so long. It's very hard to claw your way back to the level of freedom that used to exist before we had a full-blown surveillance state.
Yeah. So I cheered Obama on his first term. I'm kind of reluctant to comment on the current list of candidates, but would you care to comment on the people running as Democratic president candidate currently? Who would be your favorite?
I'll say that
on the record, it's recorded.
any of the current Democratic candidates over Trump, because they are all extremely articulate and thoughtful, even if I may disagree with certain policy platforms. Any of them would be, I think, a more stable choice for a free and open democratic society, rather than this autocratic kind of shift and impulse that Trump seems to espouse. And again, I think a number of them would, I think, dial back the level of anger towards the media, which translates into these lawsuits going after publishers, going after sources, threatening to go after journalists, not caring when journalists are murdered. I mean, there's a whole slew of things that have happened that I really think did not bode well for press freedom in the last couple of years. And I would hope that any Democrat or anyone with a pulse, basically, who could take out Trump could only improve that.
Okay. So you're talking to the Netherlands now. Let's move international for a little bit.
Okay.
What's your take on the situation of Assange? What's his outlook?
With Assange, I mean, the outlook is he's in for a long haul. I think this is a marathon, not a sprint. I think one of the best outcomes is if he could avoid extradition. That can take a long time to play out in the courts, just the extradition prong of that. I think if he did get extradited to the US, I think he would be facing the rest of his life in prison, in probably a maximum security prison, or even worse. I don't think they would seek the death penalty against him.
You're not ruling it out either.
Right, if they would take that off the table, but certainly they've been, I mean, if you look at what happened to Chelsea, I mean, we did torture Chelsea Manning. She was tortured. I think, Assange, this has had a horrible effect on his health and sends a very dangerous message. I think in a way, because Assange is so polarizing right now, they see him as like low-hanging fruit. Let's go after the unpopular kid, and he is not flavor of the week anymore. He is unpopular at the moment, and it makes it more okay to somehow go after him. But the broad proposition in going after him is really the government. It creates precedent to go after your outlet that you're reporting from today, to go after the New York Times, to go after the Observer, to go after the Guardian, to go after Le Monde, to go after, really the precedent that would be created. I mean, think about it. It would make it okay for Iran to arrest an American journalist in Iran for violating Iran's state secrecy rules. I mean, that the kind of precedent we're creating imperils all journalists, and it's so short-sighted. And we've seen a little pushback from the press, but mainly it was like one day of op-eds saying, oh, this is bad. But there's not been a concerted effort in the press to push back on this and say, like, red line here, like this crosses a line. And whether you like Assange or not is irrelevant. This puts every journalist, every outlet, and every paper in trouble. And I know the government's tried to say, well, WikiLeaks is a hostile foreign state actor. WikiLeaks is a publisher. And if you read what the indictment against Assange says, the stuff he's being indicted for has nothing to do with any possible collusion with Russia. He is being prosecuted strictly for normal journalistic activity, like cultivating sources and using encryption to keep sources safe. These are best practices of journalism, and the government is trying to criminalize them. And that should send a chill down the spine of any respectable person who considers himself to be a journalist. And there needs to be a lot more pushback on this issue.
You mentioned Chelsea Manning, one of his sources reporting or disclosing about war crimes in Iraq, among other things. She's in jail again for contempt. What's her outlook as you see it?
With Chelsea, I mean, the grand jury works, it can hold you up to 18 months before it has to renew their action. I mean, it's not like you're in there for a set period of 5 years or something. It's weird that they're still able to hold her now that they actually have Assange in prison. And I know that's being challenged right now. Why are you still holding her if you already have arrested Assange? She has tremendous fortitude and is challenging the grand jury system. And I think her reason, I mean, she has expressed this. Her words were, not so much about protecting WikiLeaks or Julian per se, but more of a greater challenge to the grand jury system as being one-sided, completely secret, and inherently undemocratic. And the fact that they now have process and have Jeremy Hammond in jail and have Chelsea in jail, to me, it makes me suspect or wonder behind the scenes if they're trying to build an even bigger case against WikiLeaks or against other people who have been WikiLeaks insiders. And again, that's why I think it's incumbent upon anyone who cares about free press to speak out against this. It's scary that not only the editor-in-chief of this newspaper is in jail, but that people who were collateral players in the journalistic process are now also being imprisoned, and we're not entirely sure what for, because we don't have access to the grand jury transcripts. We don't know what they're talking about or what they were told before the grand jury. We don't know what the grand jury is talking about. So it's an incredibly chilling atmosphere when you see a publisher, and people who were closely involved with some of those disclosures made by that paper all being imprisoned. It's probably the most chilling message I could think of, short of murdering journalists.
Yes. So we talked about Snowden. I always try to flip to the positive side. Who's happily writing a book from Moscow, where he's got his asylum. That's extended into 2020. How do you see his outlook?
Yeah, like with Julian, I also think that Snowden's journey, I said this in the beginning, I always saw as a marathon, not a sprint. And it's been remarkable, I think, the way he's been able to participate in so many of our democratic values, including being able to work, being able to be president at Freedom of the Press Foundation, being able to write a book. So right now, under the current administration or any next administration, even if Democratic, I don't know if he'd be able to come back. But I do see at some time during our lifetimes, maybe another 10 or 20 years, but that he would be able to come back. And certainly, obviously, he's not that big of a super spy threat, or else his girlfriend, now wife, wouldn't have been able to freely travel back and forth between the US. Same with his parents, same with his lawyers. So I think he's playing the long game, and as he said, he's kind of an indoor house cat, and doesn't mind if he can't. I think he feels fine walking around Russia and being public, and certainly he's been able to live a very functional and productive life despite all the hurdles the U.S. has tried to place in front of him. I think he's a really good survival story, that even when the U.S. throws everything at you, you can still come out on top, and it's sort of a good counter narrative for what Julian's unfortunately going through right now. Yeah. I mean, a good outcome for Julian would perhaps be him being able to go back to Australia, or the extradition proceeding ultimately failing and him being kept out of the claws of the U.S. and them just recognizing that he's done his 50 weeks for bail jumping and just letting him go. So I think Snowden is a hopeful tale for a lot of whistleblowers. Same with Tom Drake, same with John Kiriakou. Right. These guys have been able to rebuild their lives. John has published a book, Snowden's published a book, Tom is writing a book, and are gainfully employed. So, and continue to have healthy family lives. So I think it's an important message that even when the government throws everything it has and its bag of tricks against you, you can still come out on top. I think with Dan Ellsberg, he's kind of the biggest example of this, because the government originally called him a traitor and an enemy of the state, and treasonous. And now he's regarded as the patriarch of whistleblowers, and no one assails his integrity. I've never heard anyone in the US say without getting completely booed that he is anything but patriotic, and concerned and devoted to his country. And I think ultimately, if you take the long view, eventually they will fully see Snowden in that way, Tom Drake in that way. In fact, Dan Ellsberg himself has said, "I am Tom Drake. I am Edward Snowden." It's just taking the U.S. a little bit longer to fully process that.
I got you. Well, that is like a red thread through all those stories. They end up decorated. And you yourself, well, you've won the Sam Adams Award for Integrity and Intelligence for the work that you do. Another thing that you did is you started Whisper, Whistleblower and Source Protection Organization. Would you care to elaborate on that?
Sure. Yes, we wanted to start an organization. A lot of whistleblower programs, a number of whistleblower groups have protection in the US. Environmental whistleblowers have protections. Corporate whistleblowers have protections. The one area where whistleblowers don't have protections is in national security and intelligence. And I saw this as an increasing problem, and enough so that it inspired me and Kathleen McClellan, who I work with, to start our own whistleblower and source protection program with a focus on national security and intelligence whistleblowers, because we realized they faced a unique set of challenges in not having protection, in being subject to secrecy agreements, in having government agencies that are really used to being unaccountable, going after them. So we also started our program within the context of Expose Facts, which is a journalistic program, so that I see these as intertwined. Source protection, whistleblower protection, these need to be considered together. They're two sides of the same coin, and it made sense to start thinking about it that way. The word whistleblower is really loaded. People love them or hate them. But when you think about protecting journalistic sources, especially when you've seen the way the current president of the United States and the former president have gone after regular sources, I think people are able to see it as part of a broader front where we need to push back. And that's what we aim to do. We try to blend using a combination of the legal system, investigative journalism, and technology to be able to get good outcomes for whistleblowers. Okay. And often you need all three. It's not one or the other. Usually it's a careful blend of public outreach, of courtroom battles, of keeping everyone safe in the meantime, and not having the government further intrude while you're trying to do your legal work. And that means helping clients set up safety measures with encryption, and being able to have confidential and protected meetings with journalists who may be writing about their cases, and setting up meetings and outreach to the few other people who've actually had to go through the same thing. Yeah. And it's a very small universe of people who've been faced. I mean, even though the number of leak prosecutions is increasing, overall, we're still talking about a very narrow universe of about 20 people in our country total who have ever had to go through this. So it's a very small universe, and we're trying to create a safe place and help people, help journalists do their job more safely, help whistleblowers blow the whistle more safely. There have been a lot of advances in technology, certainly secure drop and other anonymizing software that's out there, easier encryption. All these things have come about in recent years, and they're all helpful, but none of them are foolproof. And the more we act together with whistleblowers, with journalists, and with trying to create and ensure that these safety valves are airtight, the better it's going to be for a free and open, independent press that's actually able to do in-depth investigative journalism.
Okay, thank you. Now, yeah, another thing I wanted to ask you is, it may be a small, relatively small area of law. I mean, you're practicing attorney. How are you perceived by your peers? On the website of Whisper, I read, defending whistleblowers, who are often isolated and smeared as traitors, is not generally a popular or well-funded endeavor. How are you perceived by other attorneys?
Fundraising is our biggest task. There are a few other organizations that do somewhat similar work, either representing whistleblowers. There are certainly other whistleblower organizations, but not focused on national security and intelligence employees. And there are other organizations that are focused more on the free press angle, the Knight Foundation and Freedom of the Press Foundation. So there are other organizations that do a piece of what we're doing. But funding is always a challenge. It's always probably the biggest challenge that we have to deal with every year on an administrative level. It takes up more time than I would like to spend my time being a lawyer and doing these cases and not have to go through the fundraising. But unfortunately, that's kind of the downside of starting your own nonprofit. It's the unfortunate side, but if anyone wants to support us, you can easily Google Whisper and expose facts, and there's a way to donate to us.
Cool. I'll put it in the links,
yeah.
Jesselyn. Yeah.
Thank you. I'll send you.
And I want to also say, I know you're extremely busy, so thank you so much for taking the time to talk to the Netherlands and do this interview. Another thing I wanted to ask you, in 2014 in a London Real interview, you described the way UK immigration gave you a hard time coming into the country for being a lawyer working with whistleblowers. So you're still doing this work, and if anything's changed, you're doing more high profile than ever. Are you still experiencing that kind of pressure?
I have not experienced anything as over the top as that border force when I, at the very beginning of the Snowden case, and when I was visiting Julian Assange. I have luckily not had another incident like that, though I know other human rights activists and lawyers who have had trouble, have been arrested, have been imprisoned. There are human rights activists and journalists currently in prison or facing judicial process. I feel like things were at a fever pitch in the 2013, 2014, when all of this stuff exploded onto the international landscape. I think cooler heads are prevailing, or the government's realizing it's not the best look to go after human rights attorneys who are representing high-profile clients who have the media lens on them. Also, communication's gotten a lot better. I've also gotten more sophisticated when I travel. There are certain countries I can travel to where I have lawyers on standby if there is a problem at the airport, like there was at time. Yeah. So there are numerous precautions you can take, and I feel like the world is watching more, which can actually work in your favor when the government's trying to kind of death by 1,000 paper cuts. intimidate you, give you grief, impair your ability to represent your clients, make it more difficult. It's not that the government won't still try that. I mean, clearly that was an issue with Assange. I mean, his lawyers being able to visit him, being able to visit with him privately, things like that. But people are on top of it much quicker. It's easier to get media attention to it. There are more eyes watching. More people have access to the internet. More people are paying attention. And it's kind of harder to engage in that petty, low-level death by 1,000 paper cuts retaliation.
And also, I mean, I talked to Nils Meltzer. United Nations walks into Belmarsh prison and assesses that Assange has been psychologically tortured. So that's the United Nations making that statement, having assessed that. So
I think the difference there is at least his report got out, whereas when Chelsea Manning was being tortured, even when people were reporting on that, those reports, I mean, the government was trying to censor reports by human rights groups. They were not letting human rights groups visit or even go, whether it was Chelsea or Guantanamo Bay. They were keeping human rights activists, human rights organizations, keeping them at bay, and we couldn't even get access. So the fact that Meltzer was able to go there and report out is a step in the right direction. Absolutely, it is unconscionable that Julian Assange or anybody should be subject to torture. That absolutely is abhorrent, flies in the face of justice, and undermines any criminal case that they're trying to bring against him. Yeah. And I'm glad we have rapporteurs. I'm glad we have inspectors general. I'm glad we have oversight bodies that are able to bring a bit more honesty to this. I still think far too much still is occurring in secrecy in these cases, but at least with people like Julian Assange, you have a wider audience watching. And actually a lot of journalists who are watching. I just wish they would watch more loudly.
Okay, exactly. Okay, so we're coming to an end of this conversation. The last point that I had prepared here is in 2014, you also worked on a movie called Silenced. And when you talked about that thing at the Tribeca Film Festival, where it premiered, you said, the biggest difficulty we have right now is apathy. So that was 5 years ago. What's the biggest challenge today? Is it still apathy, or has it changed?
Apathy is still a problem, but I would say maybe the bigger challenge or a collateral challenge to apathy is secrecy, because part of the reason people can be apathetic is they just don't know what's going on. And it's not until you actually are able to see a visual of a child in a cage, or you have a whistleblower who says, I put kids in cages and they didn't have their diaper changed for 3 days and they weren't given food. Apathy can be driven by secrecy. And I think we've had a greater tendency for secrecy, not just in the US, but worldwide. And so right now, I would say secrecy is one of the bigger challenges. The irony that the more openness and transparency and access we have with the internet, you would think secrecy would be less of a problem, but it's created a perverse incentive for the government to try to keep the bad stuff it's doing in even greater secrecy. And it's hard to get Nils Meltzer in there to see what's going on with Julian. It's hard to get human rights people down to see the kids in cages. It's hard to get access to Guantanamo Bay to go see like what's going on. Why are there still prisoners there, and why are we thinking about reopening it? It's even harder to get that access. And when you cloak it in secrecy, that becomes a almost insurmountable barrier. And one of the correctives for all that secrecy is leaking and whistleblowing. and the journalists who are willing to publish those disclosures.
Yeah, well, you also worked for the government accountability project called the whistleblower.org. And by the way, all stuff that we talked about, I'm going to make sure that there's hyperlinks under the clip and on the blog post of this interview, so people can read further on that. But I want
the whistleblower.org is no longer the proper one. It's jess@exposefacts.org, and I can send that to you.
Oh, fair enough.
Okay,
thanks for that. What I wanted to close with, though, was a quote that I found there. And it says, and it hooks into what you just said, whistleblowing begets more whistleblowing, and courage is contagious. That's what we're seeing also currently, isn't it?
I agree. I do think courage is contagious. I think Edward Snowden said, part of the reason he blew the whistle and did so in the way that he did was because he watched what Thomas Drake had gone through.
Yeah.
He watched him go through it channels and have it backfire on him. And that's why he went to the media. I represent whistleblowers who saw what Snowden did and were encouraged by what he did, or by what Chelsea Manning did. I represent a whistleblower now who is inspired by Chelsea Manning. So I do think courage is contagious, and that whistleblowing helps other whistleblowers come forward.
Oh, thank you for this interview. Jesselyn Radack. All the best with all the cases that you do. Thank you.
Thank you so much.